All right, this is another Field Goals Hangout. I'm Kenneth Arthur. With me again is Danny Kelly from Field Goals as well, and Rob Statton from Seahawks Draft Blog. And coming in later will be Jackson Bevins. And today we're going to be talking about the NFL Top 100. The NFL a few years ago started coming out with this Top 100 list as something else to do in the off season, I suppose. It really doesn't seem to matter in the grand schemes of things, but it's hard to say whether or not anything really matters in life. So whether or not if we go and spend some time debating a top 100, what the hell? Why not?
You're getting all philosophical, Kenny.
A little bit, but it does give us something to do, which definitely makes the 3 and 4 guys here a little bit more. I mean, we're addicts. So they just announced the top 10 here on the NFL Network, and coming in at number 7 was Richard Sherman, making him the top defensive player in this list. So that's the big one for the Seahawks. Sherman is also up for an SB, going as the most improved player in the NFL, which kind of seems interesting considering, I don't think that a lot of people will see him as a hugely improved player, maybe a way more recognized player around the league. But he does improve from 50 to number 7 on the NFL Top 100. Danny, is there any sort of reason why? Well, let's just say this. And obviously it's up for debate, but is Richard Sherman the best defensive player in the game?
No, I think J.J. Watt probably would hold that distinction in my opinion. But he's definitely in the conversation for, I don't know, top 5, and he's certainly in the conversation for the best at his position. It's one of the hardest positions in the game of football. So I think it's not. I think it is a bit much to name him the top defensive player in the NFL, but it's not crazy because especially the way he dominated it this year, he was targeted the least amount of any cornerback, starting cornerback, and he had the most interceptions. He had the biggest play arguably of the entire season. He had a couple of huge plays that really sealed wins for Seattle. So I don't think it's like absurd, especially in a type of ranking thing like this where a lot of it is sort of to create conversation. But if I were making the list, I would probably put him in the top 5, but I would probably put J.J. Watt number 1. I just think Watt is so devastatingly dominant.
Right. There are a lot of. It's all depending also on what your team needs and what you think that your defensive philosophy goes most with. And for Pete Carroll, it's such a good fit that if Sherman was on another team, perhaps he wouldn't see quite that much dominance. Rob?
I think if you, like, the other thing, and just to add one last thought on that, is, like, you can throw the other direction with Sherman and you can run the other direction with Sherman and, theoretically you can avoid him. But J.J. Watt is, like, he's in on every play. You cannot go away from him. He's going to be disruptive on almost every single snap. He literally is disruptive on almost every single snap. It's absurd. So that's my last thought on that. Go ahead and swing it over to Rob for his thought.
All right, and saying it, to add on to that, it is sort of interesting. Whereas they did throw so much less to Sherman this year, and he was more productive. And to think about it in that context, and it's tough to ever just sit here as a Seahawks fan and say something that might be less flattering than to another guy, but this could have been Sherman. I could see it more possible that this was Sherman's highlight year with just how perfectly everything went, whereas J.J. Watt, you kind of get the feeling that they're never going to be able to stop J.J. Watt. For sure, I could see a strong argument there. Rob, would you say that Sherman is the best defensive player in the game, or let alone the best defensive player on the Seahawks?
That's the point. I mean, you could make a case that he may not be the best defensive player on Seattle's roster. I mean, it could be Earl Thomas. So I think Sherman 7 sounds about right because they don't. I've not got the stats to hand, but he was thrown to the least amongst the cornerbacks in the NFL last year, and still made the most interceptions, still made huge plays, game-winning plays. against San Francisco in the championship game, and also the big play against Houston. Just countless
Yeah.
big plays. J.J. Watt's the best player in the NFL. The whole list just is ridiculous because how the hell is J.J. Watt the 12th best player in the league? There's
Yeah.
just incredible. He could be. You could easily make a case for J.J. Watt being the best player at any position in the NFL. I mean, he should be in the top 5 for sure.
Yeah.
To think that there's 11 players better than J.J. Watt in the league is ridiculous. And if this seems to me that the whole list is compromised by the fact that Houston were the worst team in the NFL last year. What difference does that make on how good J.J. Watt is? I mean, J.J. Watt is without a shadow of a doubt the best defense. As Danny said, you can throw away from Sherman. You might still lose the game, but you might have a little bit of success, targeting the other corner. What can you do? How do you stop J.J. Watt? What is the plan to stop J.J. Watt?
Yeah.
No one has come up with that yet. So he is, for me, the best defensive player. But that's no slur on Richard Sherman. I mean, he's a great player, and he deserves to be in the top 10 of a list like this.
Absolutely. And last year, I think there were 4 defensive players in the top 10. This year, only Sherman, for some reason, was able to make it in there. But I think they had 3 running backs, which I think is a little interesting. Jackson, I saw you nodding your head a lot about J.J. Watt. Obviously, maybe you agree that he could be the best player in the NFL?
Yeah, he's certainly my favorite defensive player in the NFL. And, I mean, as long as he's drawing breath and is anywhere close to his prime, he's the best defensive player in the NFL as well. Like Rob said, there's things you can do to scheme away from other really disruptive players. The only way to avoid having J.J. Watt be involved in your play is to not snap the ball. And I think he's probably the guy who affects opposing offenses on a play-by-play basis more than anyone else.
Right. So if with the other 3 players to make the top 20, you got Marshawn Lynch at 14, Earl Thomas at 17, and Russell Wilson at 20. Let's say that we were sort of playing a style of game that was like fuck, marry, kill, right? So you have 3 people, and you could not do those 3 things, but let's say this: overrated, underrated, perfectly rated. Danny, out of Marshawn Lynch at 14, Thomas at 17, and Wilson at 17, have to do what? Overrated, underrated, perfectly rated.
I would say Earl Thomas is probably underrated. I guess I would say that's a good question. I might get some flack for this. I'd say maybe Russell Wilson's a little bit high, but not a lot. And then I'd say Marshawn Lynch is about right. And I would maybe switch those 2. I'm very indecisive, obviously, but I would say Earl definitely is underrated in this ranking, and then you could flip a coin for whether Lynch was maybe a little bit high just because of the other guys that are around him. And then Russell Wilson, he's superb, but I don't know if he's necessarily better than a lot of these guys that they have listed. So. That would be I would say probably Wilson's a little bit high, and Earl's a little bit low.
Yeah, I mean, there would be a lot of debate for the people that care to spend it talking about Wilson being the 5th quarterback on the list.
Right,
others say he's not in that top 5. It certainly caused a lot of discussion over the past few weeks in terms of Sando's list. Jackson, what about you? Overrated, underrated, perfectly rated?
I think that Marshawn's probably a little high, not because he's not a top 5 running back, because he is. I just not sure comparatively his impact is as high as his rating, and a lot of that's positional, I think. But it's also, when you're a skill position player, there's going to be more press, more coverage, more attention, and that's going to affect the ratings, I'm sure, to a degree, as evidenced by how many running backs are near the top of the list, with Peterson, McCoy, Charles, Lynch, etc. So I think he might be a little bit high, but not much. Russell sounds about right. I don't know that I'd put him in my top 20 yet by the time it's, but he'll probably spend the next 5 to 10 years in the top 20. Earl's underrated. He belongs in the single digits. I think he's the linchpin for the best defense that the league has seen in a while. I don't know that there's anyone else on the Seahawks that if you take them off the list, you have to change, or take them out of the game, you have to change the scheme. You take Earl Thomas out of the game, you're changing your defensive scheme. You can't run what they do with a league average safety. So I think he's the most important player on that team besides Russell Wilson, and I certainly think he deserved to be a top 10 player.
Yeah, it is a bit. I mean, forget about NFL's opinion. I mean, if cosmically there would be a top 10 people in the NFL, somehow there would be some answer to that. And the fact that two of them could play in the same unit on the same team seems to be a rather incredible truth about this very moment in Seahawks history. Going back a bit to Sherman, Rob, when you were scouting for the 2011 draft, did you ever think that when you were watching, I don't know how much you watched Richard Sherman, but you probably watched a lot of him after the draft. When you saw his skills as a receiver, there was talk just recently when he was named in the top 7. Ike Taylor, also a cornerback, was talking about his ball skills as a receiver. Is there any way that any coach or scout could emulate and try and find a player that had those kinds of ball skills, where basically if he knows how to get in the right position, or is this a unique skill for Sherman only, or is it not a skill if he just right place, right time?
I think that the coaching in Seattle has a lot to answer for it. Funny enough, I did watch more on Sherman than perhaps some other quarterbacks who kind of graded to go in the later rounds. Somebody, I can't remember who it was. It may have been Scott Enyart or somebody else suggested that he was a fit. And I ended up watching. I had about 3 Stanford games saved in my system, so I went and actually specifically looked at Sherman before the draft. And I think it was the Arizona game the year before he was drafted, where he made a couple of big mistakes, where he kind of took a chance and missed out, and you could kind of see there was something there, but also he didn't look particularly reliable. But it's just there is something about Seattle's coaching that is just capable, especially in the defensive back position, to just bring somebody in, say, okay, this is what the skill set this guy has. He can run, he's got the length, he's got the ball skills, he can be physical, he's confident. We can turn this into something we can use. And I've no doubt, I mean, Sherman's going to be there for a while now, but if they'd let him move on, I don't think they would have replaced Sherman with an exact replica, but I'm sure they would have put somebody in his place who could have done the job. So I think that the coaching is a major part of this, and it just so happens that Richard Sherman is a talented enough guy in his own right that it's just sort of the perfect storm with that.
Danny, we don't, it wouldn't be typically necessarily to say that a player can go on and have, high interception seasons over and over again. That being said, it's not very typical for a 5th-round pick to have 20 interceptions in his first 3 seasons. Do you think that, do you see skills specifically in Richard's games or in the X's and O's of the defense that you think could allow him to put up, continue to put up these kinds of interception numbers?
Yeah, it's going to be tough for him to match the 8 again, just because, like Rob had mentioned, they don't throw to him very often, and I think that's probably even going to get, there's probably fewer attempts in his direction than next year. But if you watch how he plays, he literally will run a receiver's route for him, like underneath him. And so it's not like a fluke that he's getting these interceptions. He had like 1 or 2 that were like, I think he had at least 1 that was on a Hail Mary this year. But these interceptions that he's making aren't flukes. He is literally step for step running with the guys and running his route for him. Literally, he'll like make the cut or the break before the receiver even does. So, people talk about his physical abilities, and that's huge. He's actually a lot better athlete than people give him credit for. He's not straight line fast, but he's extremely shifty and quick in a short area, and he can jump really high. But he also, like a big deal is that he can predict routes and recognize cover or recognize schemes, recognize like different route combinations and things like that. And that's really where he separates himself from the group and how he's so elite. So I think he'll continue to get a lot of picks just because he's running that he's getting to the spot that the quarterback is throwing the ball before the receiver's even like making his cut. And he'll get burned every once in a while because of that. Like you'll see him get like burnt on a double move because he'll see and react to what he thinks a certain route combination is, and then the guy will run like a double move and he'll get burned. But that's really rare. People love to bring it up just because he's such a polarizing guy and such a braggart and everything. But yeah, I think he'll continue to get a lot of picks just because of that.
He has been a polarizing figure up until I think the point that there was when people saw him play in those big games in the playoffs. A lot of people were like, sort of hated the fact that they had to respect the fact that he had backed it up, at least for now.
Yeah.
I know that I've heard some sort of chatter in this regards from you, Jackson. You sort of in a perfect world wish Richard Sherman would just play the game?
No. I don't really have a set opinion on how athletes should act. Like, I don't think there's a universal mentality. I think that, and this is one thing I appreciate about Pete Carroll, is that all the way up until the point that you're hurting the team, he's going to let you be you. And if showing up and not talking to the media like Marshawn and just staying inside your own head and your own headphones is what gets you ready, great. If, yapping gets you going, great. I mean, I think, like, I don't remember when he said it, but I remember hearing Richard Sherman talking about when he talks that's now setting a bar that he has to reach. Like, he's accountable for what he said with his performance. And if that gets him to where he needs to be, then fantastic. I think that what you might be referring to is, I think in his second year with Seattle, I remember he had an interception, and they were showing him on the sidelines, and he was just going up to anyone who would listen. And you could tell that he was, like, replaying the interception and, like, describing it to them, and guys weren't even listening to him at all. Like, they weren't acknowledging him, and it reminded me of T.O. And I remember watching, like, a T.O. mic'd up career montage on NFL Network one time. And there were so many times where he would just be talking about himself, like, 8 inches away from someone, and they're just not listening. And I remember watching that from Richard Sherman on the sideline and hoping, that he's not just a really talented guy that rubs everyone the wrong way. Now, it doesn't seem like that's the case. It hasn't hurt the team. So I say do your thing. Be the guy that allows you to be a top 10 NFL player. Whatever gets a Seahawk to perform as the top 10 player in the NFL, I'm down with. But it's stuff that when things are going well, it's all good. But loud guys can get annoying when things aren't going well. But until they're not, I mean, who cares? Whatever's bringing the rings home and allowing that defense to do what they do, then I'm good with it.
Absolutely. So those 5 guys, including Cam Chancellor, did make the top 100. I know it's sort of difficult to say who's 100. It's sort of an arbitrary number, and a guy could be 90th or 200th, and maybe there's not that huge of a gap. But probably 2 of the more notable names that I could think of that weren't on that list and really don't get talked about. When a guy like DeAndre Levy from the Lions makes the list, it sort of makes you wonder, how much better is this guy that most people haven't heard of to, say, Bobby Wagner? And I don't know, because it's hard to watch every single player. Rob, in terms of the Seahawks that didn't make the top 100, Wagner, Mebane, someone else, do you think, I would have thought that he was a top 100 player?
Yeah, I mean, those guys, I know that Percy Harvin, and these lists are basically judged on how guys performed last year, but, Percy Harvin is one of the top 100 players in the league. I'm just looking at it now to see if I can find somebody who spent time injured last year, but, I mean, there are some ridiculous names on the list. You mentioned one a moment ago, the idea that there are guards here like Louis Vasquez is at 97. That he's a better player than Bobby Wagner is pretty ridiculous. And yet, even if you go throughout the list, you could pick. I mean, isn't Kyle Williams in the top 30 or 32 actually? I mean, that's just not. I mean, it doesn't make any real sense. But I suppose you could argue the way that Seattle played last year. That you could even have as many as 10 players in this list. I mean, it's that Seattle was the best team. Wagner had a fantastic year. Meebane had a great year. Um, I think the way that he played the back end of the season, you could maybe even argue that Byron Maxwell should be on the list over some of the other cornerbacks that played there. I mean, how can Terrell Suggs, the way that he played last year, be number 26 on this list and Bobby Wagner not be on it at all? So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a case to say that there should have been 2 or 3 more Seahawks that were on this list.
Yeah, it's interesting just to consider that they do take injuries from last year into account, when Aaron Rodgers is 11th, and I think a lot of people would say that there's no way that anyone would let Aaron Rodgers, if you had a redraft, Aaron Rodgers is in the top 5 every single time.
Yeah, that's 10 spots too low.
Yeah, there's certain guys that transcend, and Percy Harvin is one of the top 25 players in the NFL. Last year he was, I think he only made it in at 90th when he played in half the season and had 62 catches for 600 some yards. There are certain guys that transcend, but definitely, Drew Brees coming in at 6, and I think the NFL is like, oh, he's a little high. Drew Brees at 6 is a little high. I don't know how that's exactly, but what about you, Danny? Do you think that Wagner, Meebane, someone else, it's not shafted, but, I would have thought. Wagner is a guy that it seems like he's up there with the best few middle linebackers in the NFL, or am I crazy about that?
No, I think he's definitely up there. I don't know if it's tough. It depends on how you look at it, really, because if you look at it from a pure, is he one of the top 100 players in the league? That's hard to really tell because there are so many positions and so many players, but I definitely think when you look at some of the guys like Rob was saying that did make this list, then you're like, okay, yeah, he deserves to be in the top 100. I was just looking through it. It's like you got a guy like Troy Polamalu at 61, who that seems to me like more of a reputation pick than anything. And then Joe Flacco, 58. Just some of these guys that they have name recognition and they have previously been on this list before. Just kind of makes you wonder. But I mean, like you said, it's tough to really know. But it's not like I've watched every snap of every one of these guys during the year. So maybe bias is showing through.
Just to be clear, Joe Flacco had 19 touchdowns and 22 interceptions last year. Joe Flacco was easily one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL. So
he's above Kaepernick. Imagine how you feel if you're a 49ers fan.
Yeah, that's where the list, I think, no one's ever really. I mean, this isn't even a list that matters. And some would say that All Stars and Pro Bowls and all that kind of stuff doesn't. No one's ever found a right formula, right? Because somewhere along the lines, how does that happen? Where it's like, oh well, there's so much, sort of these in locker rooms and stuff. The players and the coaches seem to get so wrapped up in tangibles. Well, you wouldn't understand because you can't play the game. I mean, maybe I don't understand everything, but I know Joe Flacco isn't better than Colin Kaepernick. I mean, that's not. I don't have to be, fucking Vince Lombardi to know that. Jackson, what are your thoughts on maybe someone like Meebane and after 8 years or so in the league, is this one of the most guys with one of the most underrated careers ever? Or not ever, but for the Seahawks, no Pro Bowls, nothing like that.
I think he's probably really only underrated because of how good the rest of the defense is, and he sort of gets lost in the shuffle. I think that he would be seen as a bigger impact player on a team that had fewer impact players. But from a good at your job, standpoint, yeah, he's probably one of the 100 best. But like you were saying, I don't know how big the difference between 90th and 200th is either. Yeah. Wagner seems like he should be well entrenched into the top 100. He should have a little bit of cushion too. But we'll see. if you could, hybridize Maxwell and Browner's season last year, that was a top 100 season. Tough to put either of them on there because they kind of split the year in half. But from a talent perspective, yeah, I'd put them up there. Um, yeah, other than that, depends on how valuable you think a center is. I think Max Unger is exceptional at his job.
Max Unger was on the list last year.
Yeah. So, I would think that he is probably still a top 100 player as well. But outside of Wagner, I don't think there's any really glaring omissions. Like, how could you not put, Clint Gresham on the list or whatever? Like, it's pretty straightforward, and there is going to be some name recognition that goes into it. And is it a players list? Is that who voted?
That's what they say, but then there's players that say they never got asked about it.
Well, and here's the thing, right? Like, if you're a safety, how much film are you watching on a center? Or,
Yeah.
it's these guys will probably know a lot more about the people at their position and the people lined up across from them, but and quarterbacks. But other than that, I don't know how much attention they're paying to who the best left guards are or who the best outside linebackers are. If you're a wide receiver, it's probably not too important to your job. So I don't get too caught up in it, but it's cool to see so many names near the top of that list. I mean, 5 in the top 20 is pretty exceptional. I don't know how often that's happened. It's a sign of respect given Seattle's geographic isolation that so many people on the team are given that kind of respect.
I want to, if we could just talk just in general about the list real quick. Peyton Manning is number 1, Calvin Johnson number 2, Tom Brady number 3, and then you got Adrian Peterson at number 4 and LaShawn McCoy at number 5. And then just rounding out the top 10, Drew Brees at 6, Sherman at 7, Jamal Charles is at 8, AJ Green is at 9, and then Jimmy Graham is at 10. So when you hear some of those names, you hear them above, Rodgers, J.J. Watt. For my money, the one guy on that list that I'm not saying I'm almost certain, but with the way that the things have gone over the last 6 or 7 years, I'm sure this year's Ray Rice, who was in the top 10 last year, I could see that being LaShawn McCoy. Next year, just everybody sort of, I don't like that whole running back position. Then you got 3 of them, Jamal Charles and Adrian Peterson. Anything in that top 10 really stand out to you, Rob, as far as guys that you don't see belonging there maybe now or next year? And do you feel fine with Peyton Manning and Calvin Johnson and Tom Brady as the 1, 2, 3?
No, that's not what my 1, 2, 3 would be. I mean, I can't believe that Rodgers and J.J. Watt, and to a certain extent, Robert Quinn as well, are not in the top 10. I think you could even make a case that Earl Thomas should be in the top 10. The thing with Manning is, Manning's a strange one because he's kind of like an offensive coordinator who throws the ball. And, as we saw last year, the huge numbers put up, but when he came up against the defense, and let's be right, the schedule that he had last year was very vanilla. When he came up against a team that was, prepared to get in his face a little bit and put him under pressure, he had no answer. I mean, he looked positively confused and incapable against Seattle and just very average. And we're going to give him the number 1 title because he abused some pretty disastrous AFC West defenses and in a schedule that was just far too easy. I mean, I don't think Denver, for all the moves they've made this year, are going to be as good as they were last year. I don't think they're going to put up the production, seeing as they have to play the NFC West. I've got a tougher schedule overall. I mean, I think Aaron Rodgers is the best quarterback in the league when he's healthy. J.J. Watt's the best defensive player. They would probably be my top 2. But I think that Robert Quinn deserves to. How is Jimmy Graham in the top 10? I know he put up all those numbers last year, but look, how can you watch him play Seattle twice the way that he did and then say that's a top 10 player in the NFL? And if you put him on Cleveland's roster last year instead of New Orleans, would he have put up the huge numbers? Probably not. I mean, you just cannot I just can't get behind that. I like AJ Green, but is he a top 10 player? Perhaps not. Jamal Charles, likewise. You know, is Adrian Peterson as good as he was a couple of years ago to justify being a top 5 player? There's a lot of different players who should be in that top 10 for me, and you know that 11 to 20 actually looks a little stronger than maybe the top 10.
Yeah,
You know,
it is interesting to think about. Just real quick to think about Jimmy Graham. You know, if he had been at 25, I don't understand who would have been like upset by that or confused by that if he had been at 25. Because if you asked me whether or not I'd rather have Jimmy Graham or Rob Gronkowski or Jason Witten or Vernon Davis on any given day, I don't necessarily feel that slighted if I had any one of those four guys. You know, Rob Gronkowski is the best tight end in the NFL, and that's not even a question. But he gets injured, so he falls back. And Jimmy Graham in the top 10, it does seem sort of. I mean,
well,
the guy is not even a wide receiver according to the NFL. So
here's what I'll say about that. I mean, it's important to talk about positional importance and how well you do your job and all that, but ultimately, it comes down to production. And whether you view tight end as a really important piece or whether you think he's uber inflated by the fact that Drew Brees is his quarterback and with the offense they run, he's a really difficult matchup. If you don't have Seattle's defense, he's near impossible to handle. And there's a uniqueness to that. So I understand it. Would I put him in the top 10? No. But there's never been a tight end, even if as a wide receiver his numbers are sensational. But he is really difficult to guard, and he's someone that requires a ton of attention. I don't have a huge problem with him up at the top 10. I wouldn't put him there, but I don't think it's laughable that he's considered one of the best players in the NFL because his production is outrageous.
Didn't he have the most touchdowns in the league? Did you just say that?
I didn't say it, but he did.
Yeah.
over the last 3 years, he's had. I just happened to write about tight ends today, so I had it fresh in my mind. He has 36 touchdowns over the last 3 years, which is the most in the NFL. He did lead the NFL with 16 last year. But on a per-game basis, Rob Gronkowski would still, I'd say, he'd be more ridiculously productive. When you got a guy like, when I was looking at some of the skill players that I've looked at over the last, few days, I'd say you look at a guy like Adrian Peterson, he's generational. When you look at a guy like Calvin Johnson, he's generational. When I look at a guy like Jimmy Graham, he could be a fad. I don't know if he's only been doing this for 3 years.
Anybody that can produce at the top of the league for 3 straight years isn't a fad.
Well, 2 out of 3 years. 2012, nobody on the Saints was playing that well. So that's.
Yeah, he had plantar fasciitis and all that, but I mean,
And Akeem Talib held him to 0 catches.
If Jimmy Graham was a fad, he'd have been figured out by now. And you could say that the Seahawks have figured him out, but the other 30 teams haven't.
Patriots.
His production is.
There are teams.
Well, against the Patriots, that's when he hurt his foot was in the first quarter. It's tough to judge him on the Patriots game. I mean,
there are other games though. I mean, he only had 41 yards and no touchdowns against San Francisco. Against Buffalo, 37 yards, got a couple of touchdowns, but they put a lid on it. St. Louis, 2 catches for 25 yards back end of the year. In the playoffs, Philadelphia, 44 yards, no touchdowns. Seattle, 1 catch.
Well, sure, right. And I mean, with any skill position player, I mean, no one goes for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns every game, right? I mean, you're going to be able to find games that he didn't produce as well, but he's never been consistently shut down. I don't know that he's a fad at this point. He's the next evolutionary step beyond Tony Gonzalez and Antonio Gates.
He's definitely not a fad. But I mean, just to list the games where he produced last year. I mean, he beat up Miami, who had terrible defense at the start of the year. Chicago, terrible defense all year. New York Jets, Atlanta, Tampa Bay at the start of the year when they were horrendous, and Arizona. I mean, I'd say perhaps that Arizona game in Week 3, and that's before Arizona really hit their stride. Apart from that, the teams that he really produced against last year, he's kind of one of those guys who, against a bad defense, he'll just go off. But when he came up against really good defenses, where was he? I mean, in 2 games against Seattle, he just like he didn't want to be out on the field. That's
I
the
mean,
biggest
there's
rivalry.
no the guy's 6'7", he can move, can catch, he's a unique player, but at the same time, like again, Vernon Davis can run a 4.38 40, and he's just as much of a physical freak, if not more so. Jason Witten hasn't missed a game in 15 years almost. There are other guys that on a per-game basis, and it was just when I look at Rob Gronkowski, he is closer to a guy that can put up 100 yards on just about any defense. So I'm not saying that Jimmy Graham on any given day couldn't be a top 10 player, but in this instance, I'm just a little surprised, and I don't think that it would have been very glaring if he had wound up on 25. One reader or one watcher here is talking about how Jamal Charles. I mean, when I look at Jamal Charles, I'm like, yeah, that's a good player. Arian Foster was once a good player. And when you look at the Chiefs, and you say, okay, look at the Chiefs, and you go, okay, Larry Johnson was once a dominant player. Priest Holmes was once a dominant player.
Yeah, but those are guys that did like 1 or 2 years. Jamal Charles is the highest yards per carry in the history of the NFL. Jamal Charles can block. Jamal Charles can catch. I will defend Jamal Charles as a top 10 player whenever I have to, because the thing is, the Chiefs had no offensive punch, and he scored all of their touchdowns. When the opposing defense knew every week the only guy who can score touchdowns is Jamal Charles. Jamal Charles is more effective in short yardage situations than Marshawn Lynch is. He is an exceptional player that turns a game. I mean, it's really trendy to poo-poo skill position players and say that they're overrated. But again, it comes down to production, and Jamal Charles produces and always has since his first year in the league. I mean, the guy is. I don't think there's a bigger home run threat on offense than Jamal Charles.
I mean, I personally, I do think that Priest Holmes had him up until, Priest Holmes for 3 straight years, he scored like 60 touchdowns. It was some ridiculous number. So it wasn't quite just a flash in the pan. And Arian Foster was productive from day one, and it's with running backs. I'm just like, one tear to the knee, and that's it. Jamal Charles has already had it once. I'm just not so sure that any running back outside of Adrian Peterson would even be in the top.
He's the best running back in the league. Like, if the argument is that you can blow a knee and be done, yeah, one injury shelved all those other guys. But Jamal Charles has done it, and he's back to being maybe the best running back in the league again. I mean, I'm not sure where the knocks on his game are. He is exceptional at everything he's asked to do.
Because there's just certain, to me, there's just certain things that a player can. I realize that Jamal Charles can take a game over, but in that same instance, I don't think that if it wasn't for the fact that they had Alex Smith, they wouldn't have been 11-5 last year, because they had Jamal Charles and they sucked, and then they had a quarterback that doesn't suck and they're good. So
they didn't add a quarterback; they added 10 returning starters that were hurt the year before too. I mean, and they went from Romeo Crennel to Andy Reid. I mean, it's not just that like Alex Smith came in and all of a sudden they were 11-5. I mean, that defense also went from one of the worst to one of the best last year. I don't know, man. I have a hard time with knocking. I mean, you can't ask Jamal Charles to do his job any better than Jamal Charles does his job.
Danny, you've studied all the teams. You got some thoughts here, obviously, on perhaps the tight ends, the running backs, Jimmy Graham, Jamal Charles.
Yeah, I think I agree with Jackson more about Charles than I do about Graham. I think I think Graham, he's definitely really, really good. But like Kenny kind of was saying, I think people probably wouldn't get up in much of an uproar if he was like number 23 or 24. But still, like Jackson said, he has the most touchdowns of any guy, especially just this year, since they're talking about this year. He had the most touchdowns in the NFL, and that's a big deal. That being said, like Rob was saying, he does disappear at times. And but then again, Seahawks made Drew Brees look pretty average 2 games this year. Made a lot of people look pretty average in terms of what they were able to do on defense. So in terms of Jamal Charles, I'm with Jackson. I think their offense flows through him. I think if you look at the amount of production he had, it was like 80% of their offense or something absurd. He catches the ball, he runs, he's ridiculously good, between the tackles, But I think at the end of the day, you're kind of splitting hairs when you talk about, is he top 10, is he top 20? I think if you have 32 teams, you're going to have at least probably one or two elite guys on every team. Not every team, but you'll have, there's a lot of really good players in the NFL. I think you're kind of splitting hairs when you talk about where they are in the top 10 people. I think Rob said earlier, the 11 to 20 is looking better, and I can't necessarily argue with that. I think there's a lot of really good players, and when you have guys like J.J. Watt and Aaron Rodgers in the top 20, or not in the top 10, then I mean that's saying something. So I do think, just in terms of the skill position thing, like Jackson was saying, right now sort of the narrative is running backs are fungible, and you can just find a guy off the street and he'll plug him into your offense, just have him run into the guys. I think that's totally ridiculous, because if you look at guys like McCoy and Lynch and Jamal Charles and even Arian Foster, I think Arian Foster is one of the funnest people to watch play. That guy's lateral cutbacks are absurd, and he makes it look so easy.
Yeah.
He's just kind of like jogging along. All of a sudden, he jumps like 5 feet to the left and gets around everybody, and it's like no big deal. And he's like 220 pounds or whatever. So it's like not everybody can do this, and you could say that kind of thing about a lot of the top backs in the NFL. I think just in general, running backs are still really important. That's why we're so excited about Kristen Michael, because he could really be special. He could be like a Damian Tomlinson style talent in terms of his talent. I'm not sure. Obviously, you're comparing him to like a Hall of Fame player, but just in terms of his physical abilities, that's kind of the style he runs with. So I just think in terms of the top 100, you're splitting hairs a little bit when you get into the top 20, but these guys are seriously elite players, and most of them deserve it.
All right, well, we're gonna move on. I think that was a fun debate. Gotta mix it up a little bit between myself and Jackson.
Yeah, don't get into an argument about Jimmy Graham with Jackson. His fantasy team is named after Jimmy Graham.
Well,
yeah, but come on, don't undercut me like that, man. That's not.
Just kidding.
That's not why.
I know.
So we're running short on time. We're not going to do King Arthur's Court, because I'm much more interested a little bit more in, say, this question. Let's say that the list was based on some sort of draft, and you were ranking these people in order for you were going to take for your team to start a team, give you the greatest chance to win. Now let's put in the head coaches in the NFL. Where do you think that a guy like Pete Carroll or Bill Belichick? Now again, Pete Carroll, I mean, you're taking him now, so it's sort of, he's like in the Peyton Manning stage of his career. We don't know exactly how much longer he's going to coach. Rob, if you could put, I know that Rob, you said, I think that you'd much rather, but you start a team, you'd take Pete Carroll over, say, Russell Wilson, because Pete Carroll is going to build the whole brand. So if you could put Pete Carroll into the top 100, where would you put him?
If we're not doing the King Arthur's Court thing, can you still wear the crown while we do this?
Yes.
I'll try. Stick it on. I think that Pete Carroll would be in the top 10, because he took Seattle in 2010 when they were a mess. The 2009 season was just a disaster. The team was giving up, what seemed to be giving up pretty early. You had guys going on the radio to complain about the coaches, to take over a team that had no assets and turn it into a Super Bowl champion as quickly as they did is incredible. So for me, he's the Seahawks, and we've got these great players, but without Carroll as the foundation and his philosophy, without his vision, without his coaching, it wouldn't have happened. So I'd have a hard time not putting him in the top 10. As for the other guys, Bill Belichick's a great coach, but how much, isn't he not a defensive-minded type of guy? And how well has the Patriots defense played for the last few years?
That is an interesting to think about. What other guys really qualify as of right now? Jim Harbaugh, maybe John Harbaugh. How many guys are really left? Rob, do you think that it would just be Pete Carroll maybe in the top 10, or do you see maybe them really mixing up the top 10 or 20 if you added in coaches.
I think you'd put Carroll in the top 10, and you may be able to squeeze Jim Harbaugh somewhere fairly early on. Just he's a good coach, whatever we want to say. After that, I'm not sure that there's really any other that I would put, But then I would have them ahead of Andre Johnson or Kyle Williams, so maybe I would put a few in there.
Maybe above Kyle Williams. Jackson, what about you? Pete Carroll, now in the top 100, what sort of placement does he get?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, there's no real way to quantify coaching outside of wins and losses, and that makes it a little tough. But like you guys are saying, Pete Carroll is the brand, and that's kind of a crazy thing at the professional sports level, to have a coach be the brand. Occasionally you'll see players that are sort of bigger than the team. It's rare that it's a coach, and Pete Carroll is the Seahawks. If you take Pete Carroll away, they are an extremely different team. And any time that you're talking about someone that has that big of an effect on the best team in the NFL, he's significant. So I think he's definitely a top 100 person in the NFL. If I'm starting a team and I'm picking a coach, if I'm getting Pete Carroll with the energy for a 5-year run, he's probably a top 3 coach. He's probably in the Belichick and Harbaugh range. I think Belichick, probably just because of sustained success and how often he's adapted his style to remain on top of the AFC, makes him the #1 guy. I think from an X's and O's standpoint, I think one of the most forward-thinking coaches in the NFL is Jim Harbaugh. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the way that he coaches on the field. I think he'd be hard to play for, but I think he's a great coach. And then I think Carroll's probably in that top 3 with those guys. As far as ranking them, that's tough to do, but he's significant enough that if we were including coaches, he'd definitely be on that top 100 list.
It's tough, to necessarily. I mean, right? If Pete Carroll might be the Peyton Manning, and John Harbaugh or Jim Harbaugh is more of maybe the Russell Wilson, and if you're starting the whole thing around him, where are they standing? Danny, you've studied a lot about coaching and coaching trees and all that kind of stuff, and I'd also be kind of curious, like, everything that Pete Carroll does is not like a secret, and anybody can watch the games and the all 22 and draw up the plays and sort of get some idea about the philosophies. And Gus Bradley has it all at his disposal. John Idzik and the Jets has brought a lot with him. So how valuable is just having that actual person there to be the driving force of everything? And if Pete Carroll is accused of being a top 10 player in King Arthur's Court, is he guilty or not guilty?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't know if bias is the right word, but it probably is, just because I've studied him so much that I know a lot more about him than other coaches. But I would say I would echo pretty much what Rob and Jackson both said in terms of he is the Seahawks, he is the system, his history has kind of like really led him up to this point in terms of the guys he's been mentored by. He's mentored by Bud Grant, Bill Walsh, some of the greats in the NFL. He's seen everything. He's seen every defense or offense that you could imagine. And it's like I kind of see him like Phil Jackson. Like, you could look at what Phil Jackson's done, but can you actually do it? Like, there is some sort of like savviness to what Carroll does on a day-to-day basis, the language he uses, the exact like temperament he uses all the time. I think, anytime he's just a really great leader. I think that's like something that it's really hard to emulate. And I used the example of like Steve Jobs with Apple. It's like you take that out of the equation, and Apple is kind of just like a normal company now. I think, like Jackson said, Pete Carroll is the Seahawks. He's the brand. So, in my mind, maybe I'm biased because I've studied him so closely and so much, but I think if you take Carroll out of the equation, the Seahawks are a lot worse. So, I would definitely put him up there. You know, I don't think I'd necessarily take Carroll over like an elite quarterback, or maybe like a J.J. Watt or something like that. But he's definitely up there. You still have to have the horses. I mean, you still have to have elite players on the field. But his program.
And here's what I'll say about coaching in the NFL versus the other sports is scheme matters more than in any other sport. In baseball, there's only so much coaching to be done in a game. In basketball, there's no question it is a players' league. You need a couple of good players, and you are a contender. Football is so intricate and so dynamic, and you have so many moving parts and so many personalities on the field at one time that I think the importance of a coach is much higher. And there's such a variance in what's asked of the different players. You know, in baseball, everyone is asked to hit and to field their position, and there's not a huge difference in fielding your position outside of catcher from position to position. Basketball, everyone plays offense and defense. Everyone is a part of the same thing going on. But in football, you have so many different guys asked to do so many specific things and to do it cohesively. You know, it's asking a lot from a coach. And for Pete Carroll to have created what he has in 4 years is remarkable in that sport. You know, you see huge turnarounds in basketball from year to year all the time. And you do see it in football, but it's rare that it's sustained in football. And there's no reason to think that the trend is going anywhere than where it's been for the last 4 years as far as the Seahawks are concerned. And I give a huge amount of the credit to that, to Pete Carroll and to his vision.
Yeah, and hopefully it can continue afterwards. We'll do one quick question for each one of you. Rob, do they have plays in soccer?
Plays? No.
No plays. They just free play. Danny, you've studied Pete Carroll and all of his philosophies. Do you apply those philosophies to your life, and do you make your family always compete for your affections?
No, but I do. I actually, it's corny, but I do like. I think he has a good like message, and he's extremely positive, which I definitely buy in with in terms of living your life and like trying to be happy and have fun with everything that you do. So yeah,
that's a yes. Jackson, what was it like on the set of Jersey Boys?
You know, I'm grateful that they dubbed over my voice. I don't have the Frankie Valli register.
We're all grateful for that, and we're grateful for another episode of the Field Gulls Hangout. Thank you guys for joining, and thanks anyone that watched. We'll see you next time. Bye.
All right, see you guys.
See you guys.
Later.